Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine stepping into a time machine, maybe not with flux capacitors, but using ancient DNA. It gives us this direct window into how people lived thousands of years ago.
And sometimes, yeah, what we see through that window, it just completely flips our old ideas about early societies.
Exactly. And today, we're doing one of those deep dives into a really remarkable discovery from Neolithic China that does precisely that.
We're zooming in on the Fujia archaeological site. It's in eastern China, and we're talking between 2750 and 2500 BCE. Pretty specific window.
Right. And the sources we've looked at, they show really compelling evidence of a community structured, well, uniquely, around two distinct maternal clans. Not one, but two.
Yeah, that's the core finding. Two separate mother lines defining the community.
So our mission here is to pull out the most fascinating bits from these sources. We want to understand what this mix of, digging in the dirt and reading ancient genes tells us about just how varied human social life could be way back then.
And, to really get why this is such a big deal, it helps to think about how people used to think about early societies.
The old theories, right?
Yeah, back in the 19th, early 20th century, you had scholars like Bachofen and Morgan. They had this idea, this hypothesis, that maybe early human groups started out organized around the mother's line, matrilineal.
Right. The idea being that things like private property, social hierarchies, they weren't so big yet, so maybe the mother-child bond was sort of the primary organizing principle.
Exactly. And then, the theory went, as those things did become more important property, status societies shifted towards paternal lines, patrilineal, like a progression.
A kind of evolutionary ladder for society. But it was always hard to prove, wasn't it?
That's a thing. It's a neat idea, but finding hard proof, especially direct archaeological or even tougher genetic proof from that deep past, very difficult. It mostly stayed theory.
Until now, perhaps. That's why Fujia is so exciting and might actually be that missing evidence.
It could well be, yeah.
Okay, so let's paint the picture. The Fujia site itself, where is it? What's it like?
So it's in eastern China, Shandong Province. It sits up on slightly higher ground near the coast, with lowlands around it.
And culturally?
Archaeologically, it fits into the late Dawenkou culture, specifically a local version they call the Wukun type.
And the time frame again. Late Neolithic.
Yep, late Neolithic.
Yeah.
About 250 years right between 2750 and 2500 BCE.
Okay. And what were they doing? How did they live?
The evidence points mainly to millet farming, but they probably also used local resources. They found marine shells at sites nearby, and even freshwater mussels right at Fujia.
So farmers, but still connected to the water. Was it a big place? Like a city?
No, not really. Compared to some other big Dawenkou centers from the same time, Fujia was relatively modest in size.
And that's important.
Yeah, it seems to be, because the sources really emphasize this. There are limited signs of lots of wealth piled up or really strong social divisions, big hierarchy.
Unlike some other places nearby.
Exactly. Places like Jiujia and Gangshan, other Dawenkou sites, they seem much more stratified. More wealth differences, maybe bigger populations. Fujia looks different. A different model, maybe.
Okay, a smaller, maybe more egalitarian community. And what's the really standout archaeological feature?
The cemeteries. There are two of them, clearly separate. One in the north, Fuji and Arno, and one in the south, Fujias.
Two distinct burial grounds.
And the radiocarbon dating, using Bayesian modeling, shows they were used pretty consistently for that whole 250-year period.
Wow. So at least 10 generations kept up this separation.
Yeah, it suggests a really stable community structure based on this dual division.
Which immediately makes you ask, who was buried where, and why were they separate?
Precisely the question. And that's where the ancient DNA comes in. It's absolutely crucial here.
All right, let's get into the genetics. How did they use DNA to figure this out?
Okay, so first, they looked at mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA.
Right, the stuff you only get from your mother.
Exactly. It traces your direct maternal line, your mother, her mother, her mother, all the way back. People sharing a recent maternal ancestor fall into the same haplogroup. Think of it like a big maternal family branch.
Got it. So what did the mtDNA show for the two cemeteries?
It was incredibly clear-cut. In the northern cemetery, Fujian, almost everyone belonged to one specific haplogroup, MAD3. And within that group, very little genetic variation.
Okay, so Fujia North looks like one big, closely related maternal group.
Pretty much, yeah. Now, Fujia South, the southern cemetery, same pattern but different group.
Have a different haplogroup.
Yep. A different one, D5B1B, was dominant there. Like over 95% of the individuals tested from Fujia's had it. And again, low diversity within that group.
Yeah.
But it was clearly distinct from the M8A3 in the north.
Wow. Okay, so two distinct maternal lineages, almost perfectly sorted into two cemeteries. That's already pretty suggestive.
Really is.
But what about the men? mtDNA only tells half the story, the mother's side. What about the father's line?
Right. And this is where the contrast really makes the case. They also looked at Y chromosome DNA. That's passed only from father to son.
Eh.
And here, it was completely different. In stark contrast to the mtDNA, the Y chromosome analysis showed notably high genetic diversity across people from both cemeteries.
Whoa. So no clear split between north and south based on the father's line.
None at all. The Y chromosomes were all mixed up, genetically speaking, between the two burial grounds.
Okay, let me get this straight. On your mother's side, you were strictly north or south, buried accordingly. But on your father's side, it was all mixed together. That's a specific pattern.
It really is. And when you put the mtDNA and Y DNA results together, the interpretation becomes quite strong.
Which is?
That people, men and women, were buried based on their mother's lineage. The sources highlight this. Teenage and adult males are found buried in the cemetery, matching their mother's mtDNA haplogroup.
So even if a man maybe lives somewhere else after marriage or whatever, his final resting place was determined by his mom's family line.
That's what the pattern suggests. It aligns well with what you might expect in a matrilineal society, where maternal kinship is primary, and differs from typical patrilineal systems where women might be buried with their husband's kin.
Okay, that makes sense. Did they also look at, how closely related everyone was, cousins, siblings?
They did. They used some pretty sophisticated genetic tools, things like RED, kin, and CIBD, to map out biological relatedness, even out to sixth cousins.
And what did that show?
Well, first they found tons of kinship connections among the 60 people studied. The community was clearly interwoven.
More related within each cemetery.
Yes, definitely. There was closer biological relatedness and more second-degree relatives like half-siblings or grandparent, grandchild within Fujian and within Fujias compared to the connections between the two.
But there were connections between north and south.
Oh, absolutely. And this is crucial. They found significant relatedness between individuals buried in the separate cemeteries, too. Things like ontuncle relationships, third-degree relatives, and lots of more distant connections shown by shared DNA segments.
Okay, so they weren't two totally separate groups that just happened to live nearby. They were definitely one community interacting, presumably marrying between the groups over time.
Exactly. Part of the same broader social network, clearly interacting for generations, but they maintained this really strict burial division based on the maternal clan.
One interacting community structured into these two enduring maternal clans. That seems to be the picture. What about within a cemetery? If you were, say, siblings buried in Fujian, were you placed right next to each other?
Interestingly, no, not necessarily. The analysis showed that even first-degree relatives, parents, children, siblings buried in the same cemetery, weren't always placed close together spatially.
So what does that suggest?
It kind of reinforces the idea that the main factor determining which cemetery you ended up in was your matricline membership, your broader maternal group identity. Maybe less about your immediate household or exactly where you died.
Your clan ID trumped your immediate family ties for burial location.
That seems to be the implication. So when you bring all this genetic evidence together, the distinct maternal lines, the mixed paternal lines, the burial pattern following the mother, the kinship structure showing these two groups within one community, it points very strongly to these two cemeteries representing the burial grounds for two enduring, distinct maternal clans.
And these clans were the fundamental basis of how Fujia society was organized.
That's the conclusion the genetic data strongly supports. It provides that biological underpinning for the archaeological observation of two cemeteries.
Okay, so that's the structure. Now, what about the dynamics? How did this affect things like marriage or how much people moved around?
Right, they looked into that too, using a technique called runs of homozygosity analysis.
ROH.
ROH, what does that tell you?
It looks for long stretches of identical DNA sequence that you inherit from both parents. The length and frequency of these stretches can tell you about mating patterns in a population over generations, specifically how much inbreeding or outbreeding there was. Okay, so, were they marrying people from far away or keeping it local?
Exactly. And what they found at Fujia was a high prevalence of short and medium-sized ROH segments.
And that means?
That pattern is characteristic of populations with high endogamy.
Endogamy, meaning marrying within the group.
Yes. frequently marrying or having children with others from within their own community. Over time, this leads to what the sources call high background relatedness.
Yeah.
Basically, everyone becomes distantly related because the gene pool is relatively closed.
Okay. Marrying within the Fujia community, how unusual was that for the time?
Well, it seems quite different from some other places. For example, in Neolithic Europe around the same time, many societies thought to be patrilineal often show signs of female exogamy women moving out to marry into other groups.
Right.
And the Fujia pattern also looks different from other Neolithic East Asian groups that have been studied, which often show very minimal ROH. So this high endogamy of Fujia seems, well, distinctive for the region at that time.
Was it just a really small, isolated village? Maybe that's why.
The estimates suggest the effective population size was relatively small compared to some other ancient East Asian groups. But the sources argue it wasn't likely just geographic isolation. Remember, there were other Dawenkou sites around. It seems more likely to be driven by social rules or preferences favoring marriage within the community.
Did that mean they were marrying, like, first cousins frequently?
The analysis didn't show strong evidence for lots of very close kin marriage, like first cousins. The endogamy seems to come more from consistently choosing partners from within the broader but still limited community gene pool over many generations.
Okay.
There's an interesting hypothesis mentioned in the source material, actually. They suggest maybe males sought spouses from nearby communities, but in a way that allowed them to maintain their local authority within their own kin group at Fujia.
How would that work?
Well, they point to some modern matrilineal and matrilocal societies in Southeast Asia where you see similar patterns. It can lead to men moving between communities for marriage, but high overall village endogamy because people ultimately stay affiliated with their home base. It could potentially explain both some external connections and the high background relatedness.
Huh. That's a complex but plausible idea for maintaining those maternal lines while still having some marriage exchange. Okay, what about general mobility? Were people coming and going, or did they stay put?
That's where stable isotopes come in really handy.
Right. Chemistry from the bones or teeth.
Exactly. Carbon isotopes confirmed the diet mostly millet, probably pigs involved. Nitrogen isotopes didn't show big differences between males and females and what they ate.
Okay, standard stuff. But isotopes can also track movement, right?
Right.
Strontium.
Precisely. Strontium isotopes in tooth enamel are fantastic for this. They reflect the geology of the place where you lived during childhood when your teeth were forming.
And what did the strontium show at Fujia?
A remarkably narrow range of strontium isotope values across everyone they tested, really tight clustering. And crucially, those values matched the local geology right around the Fujia site itself.
So they didn't move much.
That's the strong implication.
Yeah.
It suggests very limited residential mobility. People likely grew up, lived their lives, and were buried all within that immediate local area.
Wow. Okay, so let's connect the dots. We have the genetic evidence for high endogamy marrying within the community, and now the isotope evidence for very limited residential mobility staying put. What picture does that create?
It paints a picture of a really spatially confined and socially cohesive community. The endogamy and the low mobility seem tightly linked.
How so?
Well, if there were strong social constraints keeping women close to home, which would help maintain those distinct maternal lines we saw in the mtDNA.
All right.
And perhaps that hypothesized pattern of men moving for marriage but maintaining local ties, that combination could really reinforce both the endogamous structure and the clear separation of the maternal gene pools.
Yeah.
People stay local, marry local mostly, and the maternal clans remain distinct.
So a community deeply rooted in place, organized by these two mother lines and mostly marrying amongst themselves. Where does a place like Fujia fit in the wider world of Neolithic China?
Well, Fujia isn't totally unique in its basic material culture. It's in a region with lots of other Dawenkou sites that share similar pottery, farming practices, and this generally modest level of social complexity that Wu can type again.
So the Fuji pattern might not be a complete one-off. It could be regional.
It suggests it might reflect a wider regional way of life, yeah, not just an isolated anomaly.
But then we have those other Dawenkou sites, the bigger ones like Jiaojia and Gangshan, that did have more obvious wealth and hierarchy.
Exactly. And that contrast is super important. Those larger sites show one path Neolithic societies were taking towards more stratification, maybe more centralized power, more wealth differences.
But Fujia shows another path.
Precisely. Fujia demonstrates that you could have stable, organized, enduring social structures lasting centuries. based primarily on kinship, in this case, shared paternal heritage, without necessarily going down that road of intense wealth accumulation and hierarchy seen elsewhere.
So it wasn't just one single trajectory for social evolution back then.
Absolutely not. This variability, different social models existing at the same time in the same broad cultural area.
Hmm.
It just underscores how complex and diverse human social development really was during the Neolithic. Many experiments were happening.
So bringing it all together, what's the big takeaway for you, the listener? Why does this Fujia deep dive matter for understanding the human past?
I think, first off, this study gives us some of the first really solid, direct genetic evidence for a Neolithic matrilineal society, specifically in East Asia. It takes that old anthropological debate out of pure theory and gives us a concrete example.
Great. It fills that gap we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And because of that, it really challenges those simple linear models of social evolution. Matrilineal then patrilineal. It shows kinship systems were way more dynamic, more varied. Matrilineal organization was clearly a perfectly viable, successful strategy in ancient times.
It wasn't just a stepping stone. It was a destination in itself for some communities.
For sure. And it also just powerfully highlights how crucial it is to combine different kinds of evidence. The ancient DNA gives us relatedness and ancestry. The isotopes tell us about diet and movement. And the archaeology gives us the context, the cemeteries, the tools, the environment. You need all of it to piece together these complex social stories.
This Fujia deep dive, it's really unveiled this fascinating picture, hasn't it? A community thriving for hundreds of years, built around two mother clans, staying close to home, marrying neighbors. It's such a strong reminder of the sheer diversity in how humans have built societies.
So where does this leave us? What does it all mean going forward?
I think it forces us to ask new questions.
Like what?
Like, under what specific conditions, social, environmental, maybe economic, did matrilineal systems like Fujia's emerge and stick around? Especially when other nearby groups were apparently becoming more stratified, maybe more patrilineal. What made Fujia different?
Yeah, what were the pressures, or lack thereof? And maybe how many other ways of organizing societies are still out there, hidden in the archaeological record, just waiting for these new scientific tools like ancient DNA to reveal them?
Exactly. How much more variety in the human past is still waiting to be discovered? Fujia suggests there could be quite a lot.